Ericson three-piece unions are indeed approved for underground and wet locations when used with rigid metal conduit, specifically 3/4 inch. The approval stems from two primary sources. Firstly, Underwriters Laboratories, commonly known as UL, listing, and secondly, the National Electrical Code, known as the NEC. UL listing signifies that a representative sample of the Ericson three-piece union has been tested and meets UL requirements for safety. When a product is UL listed for wet locations, it indicates that the product is designed and constructed to prevent water from entering the enclosure or device in such a way that could cause electrical hazards or corrosion. This involves various tests to ensure the integrity of the product seals and materials under wet conditions. The NEC also plays a crucial role in the approval of these unions for underground installations. The NEC is a widely adopted code for the safe installation of electrical wiring and equipment in the United States. It provides specific guidelines for the use of electrical products in different environments. The fact that the Ericson three-piece unions are NEC approved for underground installations means they meet the NEC requirements for use in direct burial or underground conduit systems. These requirements typically address issues such as corrosion resistance, mechanical strength, and protection against water ingress. When installing Ericson three-piece unions in underground or wet locations with rigid metal conduit, it's important to adhere to the following guidelines to ensure safe and compliant installation. Firstly, make sure to use rigid metal conduit, or RMC, that is also approved for wet and underground locations. The conduit should be properly coated or made of a material that resists corrosion, such as galvanized steel or aluminum. Secondly, ensure that all connections are made tightly and securely. Use appropriate wrenches or tools to tighten the union fittings to the manufacturer's recommended torque specifications. This will help prevent water from seeping into the conduit system. Thirdly, consider using a thread sealant or joint compound that is specifically designed for use with RMC in wet locations. This can further enhance the water tightness of the connections. Fourthly, when installing the conduit system underground, make sure to bury it at the proper depth as required by the NEC and local codes. This will protect the conduit from physical damage and corrosion. Fifthly, use appropriate supports and hangers to secure the conduit system in place. This will prevent the conduit from sagging or shifting, which could compromise the integrity of the connections. Sixthly, inspect the conduit system regularly for any signs of damage or corrosion. If any problems are found, repair them promptly to prevent further deterioration. Seventhly, it's crucial to consult the product's documentation and the NEC for specific installation requirements and guidelines. The manufacturer's instructions will provide valuable information on proper installation techniques and any limitations of the product. The NEC will provide detailed requirements for conduit systems in wet and underground locations, including burial depths, support spacing, and grounding requirements. In addition to these general guidelines, there are some specific considerations to keep in mind when using Ericson three-piece unions in wet and underground locations. Firstly, ensure that the union is properly sized for the conduit being used. The union should fit snugly onto the conduit without any gaps or excessive play. Secondly, when tightening the union, avoid over-tightening it, as this could damage the threads or the union body. Use a torque wrench to ensure that the union is tightened to the manufacturer's recommended torque specifications. Thirdly, inspect the union regularly for any signs of corrosion or damage. If any problems are found, replace the union promptly to prevent further deterioration of the conduit system. Fourthly, when installing the union in a wet location, make sure to use a waterproof sealant or tape to seal the connections. This will help prevent water from entering the union and corroding the internal components. Fifthly, when installing the union underground, make sure to bury it at the proper depth as required by the NEC and local codes. This will protect the union from physical damage and corrosion. Remember that while Ericson three-piece unions are approved for use in wet and underground locations, it's still important to take precautions to protect the conduit system from corrosion and water damage. By following the guidelines outlined above, you can ensure a safe and reliable installation that will provide years of trouble-free service. Also, consider the specific environment where the Ericson three-piece unions are being installed. In highly corrosive environments, such as those with high salt content or exposure to certain chemicals, it may be necessary to use additional protective measures, such as epoxy coatings or cathodic protection systems, to prevent corrosion. It is also recommended to consult with a qualified electrical engineer or inspector to ensure that the installation meets all applicable codes and standards. They can provide valuable guidance on the proper selection of materials, installation techniques, and protective measures to ensure a safe and reliable electrical system. Furthermore, grounding and bonding are critical aspects of electrical safety, especially in wet and underground locations. Proper grounding and bonding help to minimize the risk of electric shock and prevent damage to equipment in the event of a fault. The NEC provides detailed requirements for grounding and bonding electrical systems, and it's essential to follow these requirements carefully when installing Ericson three-piece unions and rigid metal conduit. Be sure to use appropriate grounding conductors and bonding jumpers to connect all metal components of the conduit system to the grounding electrode system. This will help to ensure that the entire system is properly grounded and bonded. Also, inspect the grounding and bonding connections regularly to ensure that they are tight and free of corrosion. Another important consideration is the proper selection of conductors for use in wet and underground locations. Conductors that are rated for wet locations such as THWN or XHHW should be used. These conductors have insulation that is resistant to moisture and corrosion. When pulling conductors through the conduit, be careful not to damage the insulation. Use appropriate pulling lubricants to reduce friction and prevent the insulation from being scraped or torn. If the insulation is damaged, it could create a potential safety hazard. Also, be aware of the ampacity of the conductors being used. The ampacity is the maximum amount of current that a conductor can safely carry. The NEC provides tables that list the ampacity of different types of conductors based on their size and insulation type. Make sure to select conductors with an ampacity that is sufficient for the load being served. It's also important to consider the voltage drop in the circuit. Voltage drop is the decrease in voltage that occurs as electricity flows through a conductor. Excessive voltage drop can cause equipment to malfunction or overheat. The NEC provides guidelines for calculating voltage drop and is essential to ensure that the voltage drop in the circuit is within acceptable limits. In addition to the technical aspects of installing Ericson three-piece unions and rigid metal conduit, it's also important to follow safe work practices. Always de-energize the circuit before working on any electrical equipment. Use appropriate personal protective equipment, such as gloves and safety glasses. Be aware of the potential hazards associated with working in wet and underground locations, such as the risk of electric shock or exposure to hazardous materials. And never work alone, especially in hazardous environments. Remember that electricity can be dangerous, and it's essential to take precautions to protect yourself and others from harm. By following these guidelines and consulting with qualified professionals, you can ensure that your electrical installations are safe, reliable, and compliant with all applicable codes and standards. When working with electrical systems, it is essential to prioritize safety above all else. Electrical work can be hazardous, and it's crucial to take precautions to protect yourself and others from harm. Always de-energize the circuit before working on any electrical equipment. This means turning off the power at the circuit breaker or disconnect switch. Use a voltage tester to verify that the circuit is de-energized before touching any wires or components. Wear appropriate personal protective equipment such as gloves and safety glasses. Gloves will protect your hands from electric shock, and safety glasses will protect your eyes from flying debris. Be aware of the potential hazards associated with working in wet and underground locations. These hazards can include the risk of electric shock, exposure to hazardous materials, and confined spaces. Take precautions to minimize these risks. And never work alone, especially in hazardous environments. Having someone else present can provide assistance in case of an emergency. It's also important to be familiar with the relevant codes and standards for electrical work. The NEC is a comprehensive code that provides detailed requirements for the safe installation of electrical wiring and equipment. It's essential to follow the NEC guidelines when installing Ericson 3-piece unions and rigid metal conduit. In addition to the NEC, there may be local codes and regulations that apply to electrical work in your area. Be sure to check with your local authorities to ensure that you are complying with all applicable codes and regulations. Furthermore, it's important to use the right tools for the job. Using the wrong tools can damage equipment or create a safety hazard. Make sure to use tools that are specifically designed for electrical work. These tools are typically insulated to protect you from electric shock. Also, keep your tools in good condition. Damaged or worn tools can be dangerous to use. And finally, be sure to inspect your work carefully before energizing the circuit. Make sure that all connections are tight and that there are no exposed wires or other potential hazards. If you find any problems, correct them before turning the power back on. By following these safe work practices, you can minimize the risk of accidents and injuries when working with electrical systems. Remember that electricity is a powerful force, and it's essential to treat it with respect. Always take precautions to protect yourself and others from harm. In conclusion, Ericson 3-piece unions are indeed approved for use in wet and underground locations when properly installed with rigid metal conduit, according to both UL standards and the NEC. Always prioritize safety, adhere to all applicable codes and standards, and consult with qualified professionals where necessary to ensure a safe and reliable electrical installation.